a lot reading this book. And one thing that I learned, and correct me if I'm wrong, but in Roughhouse bar bouts, there are 3 rounds, right?
Yes.
Each a minute each?
A minute long each, yes.
So we're going to have 3 rounds today. They're going to go longer than a minute each. We're going to start, Jaed's going to read. Then I have some questions for Jaed, and then I'll open it up to ask you all what you would like to ask Jaed. And then if we have not knocked him unconscious, I believe that the judges determine who has won.
Yes.
All right.
Sounds good. Fair enough.
All right.
Yeah. I've forgotten what the order is, though. So you want me to read first?
Yes.
Or we'll talk first?
You read first.
Okay.
Kind of situate the book for.
Good. All right.
Figure out how my microphone works.
Okay. I will read first. So thanks, everybody, for coming. I really appreciate, gosh, it's so summer, you know, like every hour is precious. I thought that today I would read a very brief section from, you know, if you see the cover of this book, I think it's kind of not hard to tell like what the book is on the surface, which is, yes, a book about the year that I spent fighting in this bar in Southeast Alaska. And there's a lot of reasons why. In the book, one of the singular reasons I give is to shed some light on my family history. In about 50 years ago, my parents met during the Vietnam War. They were married on a military base in northeastern Thailand, and then came back to Maine, to Portland, actually, together. Shortly after I was born, my father left our family and took up with another family in northern Vermont. And you know, that was an experience that was sort of pre-conscious for me. I was probably 2 or 3 years old at the time that most of these things were going on. And so, like many children, you don't recognize certain histories as they're happening until maybe much later in life. And so the book is framed around the year I turned 24, and this moment of quickening when I start to understand these layers of history and unpack a past that for most of my life I'd kind of ignored or just overlooked. So that is one of the reasons I find myself walking into this bar under a coach in Southeast Alaska to fight. It doesn't necessarily on surface make sense why I was fighting. I had just graduated from Middlebury College with a degree in philosophy. Maybe not the most obvious choice for someone with that background to travel all the way to Southeast Alaska. So yes, I spent a lot of time fighting, and there's a lot of reasons why, and I spend the whole book trying to unpack those reasons. But I want to read a short passage following the fight, my first fight in this bar. The bar is called Marlentini's Lounge. It's on the 2nd floor of a 2-story building, 9 miles from downtown Juneau, around the corner from one of the biggest glaciers, a 13-mile glacier in Southeast Alaska. And I've just fought a man named Mike the Nice Guy Edenshaw. He's a custodian at a senior center in town, and I've kind of knocked him out. And I'm realizing for the first time what I'm doing in that ring, and what it's kind of waking up in me. The other thing I'll say is that there's just a couple people involved here. There's a man named Victor, the Savage Littlefield. He's a Tlingit man who's a former fighter, who's also my coach. Kid Roo Robinson, an Australian man who showed up in Alaska on a whim, and a guy named Todd the Dirty Dog Thompson, who's in this mix as well. The parking lot of Marlentini's was covered in snow. The sky was clear and full of stars. The mountains beyond the airport circled the city like giant concrete forms. As we crossed the glacier highway to the travel lodge, Todd danced in circles, shouting, "Dirty dog, dirty dog." Victor called out, the stone, that was my nickname. Even Rue had stopped scowling. Upstairs, Victor packed a bowl, smoked, passed it to Todd. Todd repacked the bowl and handed it to me. Growing up, I'd never smoked like my friends did. I always got anxious and couldn't sleep and just wanted the high to be over. But now it felt useful. I was so empty of food, of feeling, that seconds after my first hit, all the cells in my body felt like they were floating, slowly rearranging themselves in new order. I handed the bowl back to Victor. It used to be the only thing that could calm me down after a fight, Victor said. We stayed up several hours watching videos of our fights. We laughed at Todd's kick to Bennett's groin. We replayed Rue's forearm to Lumbob's teeth. But in watching my own fight, I saw a version of myself I had never known. My eyes were wide open with something like fear or panic in the first round. Then in the second, they narrowed. By the third, as I pummeled the nice guy's head with uppercuts, my eyes were alive with, it was hard to say, rage, viciousness, anger, an expression of something I did not know existed inside me. After I'd knocked the nice guy down in the final seconds, I did not even turn around to see if he was all right. As I pumped my fists and hugged Victor, the nice guy remained on the canvas behind me. He didn't get up for a full 30 seconds. Victor rewound the tape. We watched the punch sequence a second time, me slipping the nice guy's right hand, then popping up with a left. Violence, that's what it was. For the next several hours, I lay in bed, forearms buzzing, staring at the ceiling as if still waiting for the fight. About 3 a.m, I got out of bed, sat at the table next to the window, staring at the light of the street lamps. Around 5 a.m., 9 a.m. back east, I went downstairs to a phone booth, dialed my father's number. As I waited for someone to pick up, I imagined a lonely farmhouse on the side of the road, surrounded by snowy white fields. Then I heard my father's voice. "Dad." "My son," he said. He was always calling me my son. I narrated my way through each second of the fight, drawing a picture of the nice guy that made him sound like a more formidable opponent than he actually was. I wanted my father to know about the world I had entered, to see, too, the violence that had revealed itself during the fight. I must have talked for 20 minutes before I stopped to ask my father how he was doing. I'm good, he said, but his voice was drawn, hollow. He'd just come off another trip to a military base in the Midwest to debrief a group of guardsmen arriving home from Ramadi. I was up at 3 a.m, talking to guys about what it was going to be like to go from driving around the desert in a Humvee to driving around Enosburg Falls in a goddamn bread truck. He took a long breath. I heard in the exhale that same despair, the men at war, the heaviness of their pain, the truth of their suffering. Every conversation between us then had a way of spiraling into that same abyss. Real men were impossible to understand. Real men suffered. Real men were broken. Real men were alone. You know, my father said, the other day I was rereading that passage from The Sun Also Rises. You know the one I'm talking about? Jake's up in his hotel room, drunk, after Brett's gone home with some guy. You know that passage? It's a good world to buy in. I knew the exact passage my father was referring to. After he'd shown it to me, I'd read it probably 20 times. The way that Hemingway broke down existence into an economic equation. You gave up something and you got something else. You paid in some way for anything that was any good. The world, as my father liked to say in his various improvisations, was a good place to buy in. But hearing him say those words now, I could think only of the shadow of that conceit in which Jake contemplates Brett's experience. I had not been thinking about her side of it. I had been getting something for nothing. The bill always came. I thought I had paid for everything, Jake says, not like the woman pays and pays and pays. Her side of it. In my eyes, my mother was an autonomous figure, too fixated on survival to reveal its toll. For most of my life, I saw my mother as a somewhat lonely, distant figure, consumed by work. Only now that I had left her behind in Maine did I see for the first time how my father's life had created the terms of her existence. And now, talking to my father, the equation of his life appeared more clearly to me than ever. In going to war, he had made his payment. That he had met my mother, brought her back to the United States. This was his exchange of values. That she had given him a son. This was how he'd gotten his money's worth. And when he had found the next thing he wished to buy, another woman, another family, another life, he had made a final, irredeemable transaction. It was a good world to buy in, but how the woman pays and pays and pays, first with her country, her culture and origin, then with her family and her life and her heart. Yes, I said, my hand tightening on the receiver. I remember that part. My father took a deep breath, exhaled. Wow, what a story, he said. Yes, I thought as I hung up the phone. It was quite a story. Stop there.
I love that passage because it gets at all of the themes in the book, and there are multiple themes in the book, and I'm hoping what we can do now is kind of unpack them kind of one by one a little bit. And And in a previous conversation, you had told me that this book began as almost sort of like an investigative journalism deep dive into the world of bar boxing, right? And there's one passage towards the end of the book that I wanted to just read to folks, because I feel like this encapsulates the richness of what you were seeing. And you mentioned the idea of someone who was a janitor at an old folks' home, and there's folks from all walks of life who are doing this, men and women, for all sorts of different reasons.
Right.
And this passage that really struck me, you say, even the most raw, unskilled bouts, when watched with any empathy at all for the people in them, reveal a tender story about each fighter, what they are made of, who they are, what sadness they carry, what joy. And tell us a little bit about this culture and what brings people to the ring.
Well, you know, it's really interesting. I don't know if any of you have been to Southeast Alaska, maybe? Yeah, some of you. So you know that they're, gosh, you know, it's not dissimilar to Maine. So small communities connected by tight waterways, and oftentimes the communities have deep indigenous history, or are primarily indigenous. So and they have long-standing historical, either clan or tribal affiliated rivalries. So there is a promoter who showed up from Anchorage. He's kind of this like arch huckster P.T. Barnum figure who arrives in Juneau in the late 1990s. He has a history of setting up bar boxing shows in bars. One of his like quotes that I just hear every time I think about him is like, "It just so happens that a dance floor is about the same size as a boxing ring." And it's this idea that like you can always get someone to, people always show up if there's a fight, you know. So he shows up to Juneau and brings in all these people, and his name's Bob Haig, and I talk about him at length in the book. He offers anyone the opportunity to step into a ring for $150 for 3 one-minute rounds to show everyone how tough they are. From the outside, that sounds like a pretty vulgar and maybe not very appetizing thing to take part in or watch or pay $35 to see. But it takes place during the wintertime in Alaska. There's sometimes not much else going on. I mean, there's a lot else going on, but for a certain group of people, myself included, that was the best show in town. And so the people come from all different walks of life. That's kind of the appeal of the show. There were, one of my favorite opponents was a man who'd been working in the Greens Creek mines, several miles underground, up at 4 in the morning on a ferry, working in the mines all day, and then getting out of the mines and coming to fight in a bar. But people come from all these different places. The line that Haig often used was a fisherman fighting a cop, a school teacher fighting a bus driver, sometimes the guy next door. And these were all like wonderful little buzzwords that he had to advertise his show. And so anyone shows up, and like I said, from the outside it looks really kind of raw and primal and vulgar. But when you start to hear the stories of these people and what brings them into the ring and why they feel like they need these 3 minutes to show the world what they're made of, you can't help but understand that what drives them is maybe similar things that drive all of us.
And you list some of the motivations. Sometimes people need money for a new snowplow. Sometimes people are sort of fighting through their own demons and things like that. And one of the tensions that shows up in this book again and again that you experience as a character, and some of the other fighters experience, is you talk about this tension between like this energy that you get from being in the ring and also the profound loneliness that so many of you are feeling. Can you talk more about that?
Yeah, well, I think that one of my trainer and a two-time Roughhouse champion who's produced several champions out of his community in Southeast Alaska, Sitka, is this guy, Victor the Savage Littlefield. And the Savage is obviously a name that he gave himself. He's Tlingit, and you know had grown up in a community that was about 30% Native. And he said, you know, someone tried to call me. The promoter tried to call me Big Chief until I decided to call myself the Savage. It taught me a great deal about the genesis of these names. He told me that the reason why I fight is because I didn't want to be just another Native kid who slipped through the cracks. And this idea of slipping through the cracks started to have like almost existential resonance for me, that so many of us carry histories, identities, pasts that, that for whatever reason, structures of American life tend to kind of like steamroll over those histories or those stories, or make it very difficult to give those stories life. And fighting was one way to make sure, to prevent yourself from slipping through those existential cracks. And I think that's, we can get a little more into this later, but that's one of the things that I often thought, like, what is the crack that I'm slipping through, and why is it so important that I don't? And that gets into, my own heritage and cultural history. But as we, I think the idea of falling through that crack, it's almost a despairing, kind of lonely vision of a life that if it takes 3 minutes in a round fighting someone to not experience that, like then yes, by all means, let's fight,
And there's this great moment too where we see that crack that you may be slipping through. There's so he's working as a tutor, for lack of a better word, in a high school, and he's working with Native Alaskan kids who are kind of slipping through the cracks. And the school board decides it's going to consider cutting the funding for this program. And so the Native Americans Native Alaskans who have benefited from the program and who have kids who are benefiting from them decide that they're going to come forward and kind of present kind of their story and kind of advocate for the return of this program. And as they come up to the stage one by one to introduce themselves, they begin by sort of reciting their sort of matrilineal history and ancestors until they kind of come down to themselves. And Jaed is sitting in the back row, and he's trying to decide how he's going to introduce himself. And first of all, everybody in Alaska is calling him Jaed for reasons nobody really understands. So he's Jaed, who's going by Jaed, and then he's thinking about his own history, and he's thinking about his last name Coffin, right? This venerable name from Nantucket and Nantucket whalers. And he's also thinking about his matrilineal history and his mother from Thailand, who met his father in Vietnam, who kind of wishes she came from Chinese ancestry because it's lucky. And so you're thinking about all of these different identities and how you're going to try to make sense of them. And how have you made sense of them in your life?
Thank you so much for identifying that passage. I think, and I want to return to that question, but I just feel like I need to say pause for a second, because I'm sure you've experienced this. Like, the passages that you work hardest to create and that feel the most important to you as a writer are the passages that no one seems to pay attention to critically, right? Like, people are like, oh, he writes about the fights with gusto, or, there's like an amazing father-son story here. And you're like, man, that was the easy stuff. Like, writing about punching someone, writing about stuff that happened between me and my dad. Like, I've been thinking about that my whole life. But taking, the time that I had to put in, like going back through local papers and journal entries to recreate that page and a half of the book, it was, the time that I spent doing that, and it was really extensive. So, thank you. Thanks for noticing. I will say also that I don't know. I think part of the what it means to be American is that we just have this like default assumption that we are here by some cosmic miracle. We all have our like informal creation myths, like, oh, I think my parents came here on a boat, like through Ellis Island, or maybe they were, whatever. But typically, it's amazing how often war plays a part in our migrations. But I don't have a better answer for that. I haven't, in Tlingit society, historically, it was a matrilineal line. So you identify yourself through a series of clans and house and tribal affiliations that are about 6 cycles deep before you get to yourself. So you wouldn't meet someone on the street and say like, hi, my name's Jaed, I'm from Brunswick. You would say, my mother is from the Munturun family. They're from central Thailand. Her father was from Laos. Her mother is probably Chinese. They lived next to a canal in a neighborhood owned by this family. They migrated on my father's side. He is a Coffin, that is historically a Nantucket name, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And you keep moving through those lineages until after about 6 iterations you say, and by the way, my name is Jaed Coffin. So you locate yourself within a kind of like psychic geographic lineage before you just deliver your identity, right? And so I think almost reverse engineering identity as a way to engage with the world is a pretty powerful experience. I think often about that in my own life. Like, what do we get to pass down to the people in our life? How do we identify ourselves to the people in our life? I think part of the reason I fought is because I had to ask myself, like, what is my story? And there's because for I think many of us, there's blank space.
How does fighting help you get to your story?
I don't know if it helps me get to my story, but I think it gave me an opportunity. I mean, there's nothing more. This is going to sound very strange, I think, to many people, and it sounds strange to me even as I say it, but I am the kind of person who feels the gravity of not having a story weigh very heavily on my shoulders. When I know that on my mother's side of the family, I don't really know anything about her family history. It exists in Southeast Asia. I have Facebook connections with a few cousins, but that's about it, right? I know my father's side of the family a little bit, but his family's quite limited. And of course, there's a fissure between those lineages when my parents separated when I was very young. So, and also growing up in Maine, which, as you know, is not mostly Thai, I found myself like looking for signifiers to locate that story, and in many ways saw none. And so feeling the gravity of that blank space in some way started to kind of offer me this strange like melancholy or alienation that I started to encounter in my early 20s. And I think fighting, it's so raw and physical and basic that it almost made me feel like I could just float above all that stuff in those moments. It was like the deconstruction of all those half stories finally just washing away as if like swept away by tide. And in those moments of like heated intensity in the ring, I just felt like they were gone. And that was a pretty beautiful, powerful thing.
One of the things that you write about too is that your dad has this sort of romanticized notion of like knights in shining armor and the sort of chivalrous fight, right? And that as a brand of masculinity. And then when you go to Alaska, you're meeting men who have different brands of masculinity, like Rue, the Australian fighter. And so talk a little bit about the way in which this book is sort of examining and kind of looking at different roles for men and the masculine sort of thread of gender.
Yeah, well, I think that part of the interesting or the gift of spending time to write this story was it allowed me to say, like, all right, what are the inheritances that what have I inherited as a man in America from my patrilineal line, right? Like, what are the what are the creation myths that have come my way? And one of them early on, probably too early, was encountering the work of Robert Bly, which a kind of leader of the what was called the men's movement in the 1980s that really struck a chord with my father. That evokes all these images, archetypal kind of Jungian motifs of like an inner wild man, of like some deep sense of masculinity that's like been either wounded or lost, that's deeply attached to different notions of warriorhood and so forth. My father was also very interested in Arthurian legends, and I think to this day still believes in some way that like in our DNA is like a kind of arch like royalty about what it means to be a man. So that's a very complicated legacy to inherit. And then of course there's that finds its way into a fusion of sorts with some of the messages that I was getting from a guy like Victor, who had his own meditation on what it meant to be a man growing up on an island in the Gulf of Alaska, where, yes, I mean, the things that he learned growing up were how to fight and how to hunt and how to fish. So, I don't know how those things live in me still. But to say that I kind of just like saw them and discarded them and overcame them would probably also be a myth.
But one of the things I really like is I think this really opens up for people the possibility of starting to really kind of talk about these different definitions of masculinity and what our expectations are and what limitations there are for men who subscribe to different categories and how they get kind of boxed in because of their definition of masculinity.
Yeah, yeah. I think the predominant narrative that we have about, you know, what it means to be a man is that men don't wish to be vulnerable or to share feelings. And I think in many ways that's true. But what's interesting to me is that fighting with guys on a nightly basis in a very small room with your shirts off, is one of the most intimate things you can do with a person. I mean, I can't I remember one night Victor, this isn't in the book, but one night Victor said, we had just sparred 7 rounds together, like just bathed in sweat, smashing into each other, bleeding and whatever. And he's like, oh man, my back's been really sore, too much fighting. And I said, you ever thought about, you should go get a massage, get some body work done, like kind of joking. And he's like, no man, I don't let anyone touch my body except for my wife. And like we just, you could see like the marks of me all over him and his marks all over me. And we're sitting there just like, there's a scene where I work out with Kid Roo toward the end of the book where, we've like, it's just the two of us. The gym has kind of dissolved in the spring. People are getting busy with life. And we just we meet each other every night and we spend 45 minutes like this far apart, wrestling, like totally locked into each other. And then one night I hit him sort of for the first time. And it seems to have broken his nose or moved some cartilage around his nose. And he invites me over the next night for dinner, and we watch fights. And his wife comes up, and she's like, I don't get it. Like, you just beat the shit out of each other the night before, and now you're, like, best friends. And I know this sounds like a version of Fight Club, and in some ways it is, but it helped me understand that there are ways that men historically and currently engage that it's almost like a branding problem. Like there's deep intimacy in those experiences, but we don't necessarily have a language to frame what those experiences mean to us, Yeah.
And so you go on this kind of personal quest during your year in Alaska to try to find it, and one of the places where you settle to kind of find our contemporary myth is in movies, which I think is where so many of our narratives and myths come from right now.
Right.
And you kind of eventually settle into a bunch of Vietnam movies,
right.
Which I can't help but think about your parents and their experience in Vietnam. Can you talk a little bit about what brought them both to the war and how it impacted them?
Yeah. Well, I think there's, this is something that's really interesting to me right now, because we are sitting in what is the 50th anniversary of so many experiences, moments during that conflict. My mother is from a village called Phnom Salakam, and one thing that I sort of knew but didn't really know is that the 809th Engineer Battalion came to Phnom to set up infrastructure in Thailand, dramatically changed the infrastructure of her village, and then moved north to Nakhon Phanom, or Sakon Nakhon, to the military base where my mother and father met, where my father was an officer, a communications officer with the same 809th. And they were brought together by these like massive historical global forces, and it sort of strips away the romance of love sometimes when you're like, oh, but for the Vietnam War do I exist, but I think that's kind of a reality for me, and so it's only much later. I'd been raised like many, I think, young men of my generation on a take on the Vietnam War that I was just talking to a journalist last night who was a correspondent in Cambodia in the 1970s. And she said, the thing that struck me was that the Vietnam War was always portrayed as so cool, like the soundtrack and these kind of motifs of masculinity were bred into the stories that we decided to tell about Vietnam in the 1980s. So Platoon and Full Metal Jacket and Apocalypse Now, there's almost this like psychedelic cool to the way these stories are told. So one of the things that I find myself doing for a period of the time when I'm fighting is staying up till like 5 in the morning every night, watching The Deer Hunter, watching Platoon, watching Apocalypse Now, and really feeling sad, not moved or impressed or like wowed by the exoticism of what's happening, but just sad, for one, because I realize the terms upon which these stories are being told, which is often through the lens of my father's experience, not the experience of the very quiet presence of Southeast Asians who are either dying or being murdered or serving the war effort in a way that's been muted. So part of the experience and part of the project of writing that book was to experiment with what happens when you give a voice to the other side, or at least reckon with it a little bit.
And your mom emigrates to the U.S.
Yeah.
And then I can't remember if she enlists or she commissions, but she ends up serving for the U.S. military and is deployed. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. And this is a part of her life that I didn't get into the book because I just, you can only take so much on in a single project, before the container starts to crack. But in the, actually, I was just telling this to the cab driver who I sat with between the Honda dealership and downtown.
It wasn't the one I yelled at, was it?
No,
Okay.
Totally different. Yeah, different cab driver. And when I was in 5th grade, my mother was deployed from her reserve unit in Auburn to work in an Army hospital in Panama, and for a year. And I went to my father's house in northern Vermont to live with him. He was a lieutenant colonel at the time. To live with him and his wife, who happened to be my mother's former very close friend, and to live in their home. And as a kid, it was sort of just interesting. Like, get to live with Dad for a while, cool. But I was there alone, and only now kind of recognize the irony of that my mother is now serving the country that she has made her own. While I am living with my father, who was the soldier who was sent overseas to serve in her country. There's like a lack of parallelism there, or there is a parallelism there that is so rife with irony and tension and confusion that, I don't think that the book itself had room for it in some ways.
Well, and in some of the rawest, from an emotional perspective, some of the rawest moments of the book are as Jaed is sort of unpacking these family relationships and this kind of long storied relationship he has with his dad, and some of the sort of conflict or lack of conflict or emptiness they've had, and your sort of triangulated relationship between your mom, your dad, you, and then your mom's former best friend.
Right.
And it's so incredibly honest, and I think that one of the things that nonfiction writers, especially memoirists, have to deal with is the sort of emotional toll, of writing about these very true, very painful stories. And so by way of sort of last question before I open it up to the audience.
Absolutely.
You have this, you address this very briefly in the acknowledgments, and I'm going to totally put you on the spot with an uncomfortable question.
Great.
You say, my aim in writing this book was only to understand our past. He's talking to his parents. My aim was only to understand our past so that in understanding, I might be a better father and husband.
Yeah.
And tell us more about that aim and the degree to which you think maybe you achieved it or didn't.
Or maybe just wrote that line to get a pass.
So, like, sorry, Mom and Dad.
Very noble apology that serves no purpose. I think that, I have this, after writing this book, I feel like I've developed this grand theory of history and generational experience. And it's basically that, like many families, well, maybe unlike some families, my family is pretty good. My father loves to talk, and he's always been very open with me about his experience and his feelings and his thoughts, and wants to hear mine and so forth. The one thing we didn't talk about for 30 years was why he left. We never once touched that subject. And I'll be very frank, you know, as I was writing this book, I signed to write this book with a different publisher in 2010. And for about 6 years, I struggled with this story, and I frankly didn't want to tell it. I didn't have the language for it. I felt that I didn't have the emotional temperament to dig into it. I felt that it was too complicated and almost like the ballast of a ship. You know, once I wandered into that story, everything else got thrown out of whack. I also probably felt, if any of you are memoirists, I felt like I was just making it about me, you know, that I was driving the story back to myself when there were many other interesting things to write about. So I stopped writing that story until an editor who I was working with at this previous publishing house wrote a letter to me and said, you know, the book's kind of interesting, the way that you talk about the history of indigenous people and why they fight and why you're sort of fighting and why you're hanging out with them. Kind of a neat environment you brought me to. But I remember the words, I can see them like printed on the page. She said, but your family story looms so large that to avoid it makes this book impossible. And that really rung my bell, and but not in time, because the following Monday, she wrote me on a Friday, the following Monday the book was dropped, and I owed this publisher the first half of my advance. And I'm not cagey about money. It was about $30,000 that I had to pay because I didn't deliver a product. And in a commercial sense, that's kind of a bummer. It's like, oh, that's too bad. You actually owe someone $30,000. It's like buying a brand new car that you don't get a car, And that sucked. That was dreadful. And but it also made me recognize, like, my job is to be a writer and to tell stories and to clarify confusion for myself. And maybe by clarifying that confusion, I can open channels for other people to see their own histories and to clarify confusion in their own lives. So in many ways, I feel like I'm still cringing, like, as this book is coming out, and I am not that comfortable talking about it. The words don't come easy. But I do know that after having written it, I feel like this kind of weird inner phantom has, like, risen out of my body, and I walk around a little lighter, and things don't have the same gravity that they used to. And I can look at my father and give him a hug without feeling like a little flinching sensation as I do that, And so that sounds like it's therapy, and I think it is. I talked to a therapist for the first time in my life for a summer, once a week. And she had a background in biracial clients, I guess. And she just said, just tell me what happened. And I just talked to her. And every time I talked to her, I felt a little better. I'm not like, I have no big agenda about creativity or writing or whether or not you see, it's just, everybody has their own approach. But I just know that there were things that were eating at me internally, the same way that we all have family things that eat at us internally. And I'm just better at being a dad and a husband and a person now that those things are gone. And therefore I'm not passing them on to my kids or my wife or the other people in my life. I've this sounds very mystical, but I've sort of exercised them, I think, by going through what is essentially a 9-year process of writing a book and feeling horrible about the demise of a literary career and all this stuff, So that sounds very like on the body, and I think really it is, Yeah.
I'm going to go ahead and let folks jump in. Do you all have questions for Jaed?
Sure.
You've written 2 memoirs, and they sort of take place one after another in time. I'm wondering how they inform each other, and does it feel like a continuing story? Does it feel like totally separate stories to you?
I wish that's such a, I feel like I must have asked you to ask that question before. Like, could you just ask that? Because that'll help me clarify some things. So yes, I've written 2 memoirs, and in the first memoir I wrote, A Chant to Soothe Wild Elephants, that came out in 2008. I was 28 years old. I found out not long after the publication of A Chant to Soothe Wild Elephants that my girlfriend at the time, now wife, was pregnant with our first child. So a lot of things were happening as that story was being told. But it was written, and I don't mean to be, offensive to people who are in their 20s. Like, I think your 20s are such an important time, and I loved my 20s. But I think in my 20s, I was trying to write about how different I was than other people in my life, to like let everybody know that the details of their life didn't reflect the details of mine, maybe for cultural reasons or artistic reasons or whatever. It was really important to differentiate myself. And part of that was telling a story that was very exciting to me, which was basically about being a monk. It's like kind of the coolest thing anyone's ever done. Like I remember at college when that happened, I was like, what'd you do over the summer? Oh, I interned at a blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, I was a monk in my mom's village. Like, you know, like, now what are you gonna say? You know, did you hear about that guy? You know, and so it was really exciting to have that story, and I didn't necessarily want, there's a single line in which I address my entire family history in the opening chapters of that book before I arrive in Thailand, which is, you know, my parents met at a military base in northeastern Thailand. My mom came to America when I was a little boy. My father left for another family, and then and then my mom and I grew up in Maine, and then I went to Thailand to become a monk. And that's kind of all I didn't know how that was affecting me, you know? And I still, even as I say it, I'm thinking like, am I just making this all up? Am I just looking for a good reason to explain why I fought? Like, I mean, the word that, you know, like father issues or something, you know, the oldest trick in the book. But I remember as a point when I was writing, I had this great fear that I'm just gonna write about the same thing over and over and over again, like most writers do, and I've kind of made peace with that. Like, it's okay, you know, that's what's on my mind, is like, what does it mean to have parents from two very different places? What does it mean to be an American with that history? And I know that this book, I was like, okay, what if I just take that one line where I like deleted an entire chapter or entire history of my family, and I just say that's where I start, you know? And so in Roughhouse Friday, I start with the prologue. It's called Galahad, which is kind of like my father's take on Arthurian legends and how it informs. We got these yellow T-shirts that said Cheerios on the front, and then Lancelot and Galahad on the back. And we used to walk around wearing these T-shirts. And if any of you know the kind of the deeper levels of that story, Lancelot is Lancelot largely because of a betrayal and lust with Guinevere and so forth. So just trying to be like, what if I go right to the thing that I can't talk about, and that's my starting point for this other book. So I do feel like it's like a diptych almost, or like two sides of a coin, you know? Like you turn it this way, there's like the happy, easy version. You turn it over and here's like the dark version that I didn't really want to talk about ever. And I think what we learn about those things, those taboo things, is that the more we like bury them, the more they just kind of find their way to the surface and get like a stranglehold on us, you know? So yeah, thanks, Emily. Yeah, any other questions about writing, art, whatever, story?
Think.
Okay, yeah, I'll make them hard, yeah.
Did your parents speak a common language when they met? So.
Yeah, my father never learned any Thai, a little bit, you know, a few phrases and expressions. He was actually my mother's English teacher on the military base. That was one of his like kind of semi-civilian duties. And so no, not really.
So that was probably a big obstacle in your relationship, not speaking the same language?
Probably, yeah. I'm like thinking probably, but I'm like, would that have helped? Yeah.
And another question I had was, do you know what your father's relationship was with his father?
Yeah, I do. And this is going to sound very self-promotional, but shortly before this book came out, I wrote a piece for the New York Times that was called Out to Sea, which is an expression my father uses to talk about something that men do at a certain period in their life in a kind of a whimsical, romantic way. You know, men, they just go out to sea. And this harkens obviously back to our Nantucket heritage, which I have zero contact with, you know. Says, you know, men that, you know, in their he's like, he quit his job, he left his family, he just went out to sea, you know. And it's this like very heroic, almost, you know, the examples I cite is my father's, one of his favorite movies is 5 Easy Pieces with Jack Nicholson, where, you know, at the end he just kind of like hops in a trailer or a 16-wheeler and goes up to Alaska, just goes out to sea, you know. And Don Draper, I think, is like a modern revision of the 60s man who goes out to sea. And my father told me when I asked him one time why he left a family with 2 little kids, he said, I think I just went out to sea, you know, and it sounds ridiculous, right? But then he said, I always admired my own father, because after my mother had, his own mother, my grandmother on my father's side, had some mental health, pretty severe mental health issues. She was actually at AmHigh in Augusta, and he basically, my father had just come back from the war and said, I'm not up for taking care of this, becoming a caretaker for what she's struggling with. And then he spent the next several years sailing out in Casco Bay. And my father said, I always admire my dad. He just kind of went out to sea. And it's, I feel for these guys and me and all of, whatever. Like, I feel for humanity. That's what we have to work with. That's not a coping strategy. You know what I mean? It doesn't solve any problems. It truly is. And yet we romanticize and valorize that image of someone going out to sea. Like Don Draper's character, at least for me, was kind of irresistible. You're like, oh, there he goes again. Oh, he's doing it. He's leaving it. Oh, I can't, stay, Don. No, he's not, and you're like, oh, I can't wait to watch the next episode. But it's so messed up. It releases, and there's so much kind of structural gender norms that are involved with that. So it is a family tradition. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah, in the back, sure.
The scene that you talked about, I don't know if it's in the book, but about how you were fighting with your friend, and it sounded to me like, and I think you said this, that this was a way for the two of you, two men, to be vulnerable with each other. And I don't know how other people feel, but as a woman, it seems like there should be another way other than, smacking each other in the head.
Absolutely.
So I'm wondering, since you've obviously thought a lot about these issues, do you think there's other ways for men to get to a vulnerable place without, it seems, I know this is a philosophical question, maybe more than for a memoirist, but it's still, you're bringing this issue up, which I think is just huge in our society, and relates to going out, needing to go out to sea, which one could argue is not that responsible of a choice.
Yeah.
Have you thought about sort of where do we go from here, I guess is my question.
Imagine if my answer was like, no, never thought about it. You could just walk out. Yeah, you're like, great. Yes, I have a great deal. And at the most basic level, I will say that I suffered a pretty bad neck injury much later in my life after having boxed in the Golden Glove amateur world, down in Lowell, Mass. and so forth, and had very severe concussion symptoms after that, which has given me a lot of time to think about, is that worth it? Why? So, and Ari, we were just talking about this, cool, you punch each other, that sounds really exciting and scary, and that's how you connect, go guy, yeah, man, you know what I mean? And yet, people are getting hurt, people are getting severely damaged. I remember after one fight, I had a series of 3 fights with a man from Dorchester, Mass., and in the third fight, a punch landed that opened up the bottom of his lip, and he needed several stitches afterward. And I just had this, that was sort of the beginning of the end of fighting for me. We became very close. This story is amazing, not because it happened to me, but just his wife was not well at the time, and she was in the audience. And I remember seeing him through a window as his head is tilted back and a doctor is stitching up his lip, and thinking what the hell am I doing? What world do we live in such that this has become necessary for us? And so the answer, I think the way to approach that question, and this isn't an answer, but to kind of unpack that question for me isn't, did I do the wrong thing? And maybe I should regret having spent many years of my life fighting people, because it happened, and it still happens, and but it's what world do we live in such that feels meaningful, that it's still, people feel a need to do it, you know, and I don't, this is gonna sound very judgmental of like the society, and maybe cliche, but I'm a person who I learn through physical experience. You know, I don't do very well, like, I don't learn a lot from reading necessarily or watching. I learn from doing. And I think something about the loss of physical experience, whether it be a deep engagement with the way that we produce our food or live in a daily way, like fighting scratches an itch that nothing else is scratching. You know what I mean? Like, I know from my own life, sitting in front of a laptop answering emails for 40 hours a week does not scratch that deep kind of primal itch inside of me. It just doesn't. And so we find ourselves doing quite radical things in order to find it. And the other thing I will say is that one of the things, you know, you could say, well, so you were fighting these guys and spending all this time knocking each other around, how come you just didn't play basketball instead if you needed a physical outlet? Or how come you didn't do long distance running or something like that? And I will say that fighting, historically for me and for many, many people, has been the great common denominator athletically. You don't need to have a season pass at a ski area to get in the boxing ring. You don't, you know, it favors in many ways the underclass, you know, and it's always been that way. So those are the two vectors that I see. One, that there's a world that makes us, that somehow takes something very important away from us, that we have to go to radical ends in order to find it. And two, that that it's an experience which requires very little in the way of resources to participate. You know, that I don't think answers your question, but that's kind of where I'm starting in order to find meaning to that question. Thank you for asking that, though. That's a really good question that I think always needs to be leveled around these kind of stories. Yeah. Do we have time for more questions? Sure.
Well, I was actually just in Sitka like 2 weeks ago.
Oh, no kidding.
And
Wow.
so
Yeah.
I wanted to ask about, I know the book is about the internal and the boxing room, but you were in this place, like this fairly unique place, southeastern Alaska.
Sure.
And I wanted to ask about how the physicality and the actual landscape and the water, you already talked about the waterways and the similarity to Maine in some way,
Yeah.
but even the darkness in the winter and the light in the summer, and just how the physicality of the place where the story took place shaped you or shaped your story.
Question. And such a fun thing to talk about. I thought the previous question had me kind of like, oh God, think. This is just one of those fun writerly questions where, you know, the darkness was really important, you know, and I think anthropologically, like, there's reasons why, as much as we endure the winter in Maine, sometimes I feel like we're not very good at it. Like, we're not good at being in the dark, you know, like we kind of fight it. Whereas I know that historically, in traditional Tlingit culture, the period between October and April, basically the return of the herring, the big bait fish to the shoal waters, was a time of creativity. So like that's when you just sat around and like made all this amazing art, you know? I don't find myself being that artistic. I watch a lot of TV in the winter, you know what I mean? And like talk about how cold it is. So I will say that darkness, the leveling of that darkness, I think there's a real, we have all this coloristic imagery about like, oh, and then I saw the light, and then and then the clouds parted, and like, ta-da, revelation. I think we get pretty used to that narratively as storytellers, being like, you know, truly, like the sun came out. I can see clearly now, you know, whatever. But the darkness was a time to kind of go in deep internally inside. I lived in a basement apartment under a vacant fisherman's house, like 3 miles down this long road along the coast. Like, you learn stuff about yourself living in a basement in Alaska in the middle of the winter. You know what I mean? Like, you have some, and I didn't have, this is 2003, so I didn't have a phone, like an iPhone or whatever. I didn't have internet access. I just read a lot of books, wrote more than I've ever written. Like, and the degree to which I was engaged, I was reading books. I remember I read Norwegian Wood by Murakami. Man, like, I felt like it was an otherworldly experience to read a novel like that after spending 3 months by myself in this basement. And I don't read that way anymore. And I just think that's an important message about the connection that one can have with a book and the circumstances that surround it. Now, the other thing is, of course, the mountains and the wilderness. And the wilderness in Southeast Alaska is actually dangerous. You know, I often think of Maine is kind of we think of it as like a wild place, but I think of it as a very safe wilderness. You know, I could just go out with a backpack and, like, if it rains, I'll just build a little shelter and stay warm or whatever. You're not going to necessarily freeze to death in the summertime or get lost. I mean, I know that happens, but you just stay on the Appalachian Trail or whatever. But in Southeast Alaska, it's like when you go climb a mountain, you have a map and a compass, and you just bash out in there and hope that you're reading your map and compass right. And I love that. It's just like, again, so powerful with metaphor for like entering uncharted territory of your own consciousness, you know. And the mountains have these amazing networks of ravines and ridges that all find their way into each other and stream beds, and you're just kind of like hacking around trying to figure out how they all fit together. And to me, there is a point at which, and later in the book, I talk about how I almost feel like all the disparate stories of my own life, from Camelot to, you know, whatever, like sutras, Buddhist sutras, the mountains become this. I'm standing atop one mountain looking at this vast network of ranges, and I'm like, maybe that's the best model I have for how a narrative in my own life can find resonance, you know? Yeah. I could talk about that for days. I love that question.
Can you tell them really quickly, too? You mentioned it very briefly, but I don't know that it really settled in. Tell them how you got to Sitka.
Sure, yeah. I paddled a sea kayak from Washington State up the entire length of the Inside Passage into Southeast Alaska. So it was like, you know, as the crow flies, it's about 800 miles, but I think I was not going as the crow flies, you know. There's like fjords that were taking me south and then east, and then I had to go to open water and cut back, and, you know, it was a very, like, I would love to see, like, a GPS. I did it, it's going to sound very braggy, but I say this with, like, insight into how kind of wild I was, and at 23, how lacking in, like, forethought or something, but I did it without a cell phone or GPS or EPIRB, like a location device for the Coast Guard. I did it without a life jacket, because I had this theory that, like, life jackets were modern inventions that I shouldn't be using. I held myself, I was like, if I'm going to and this is totally bullshitty, and, like, I can call myself out on this, but I remember meeting these native guys on the Macaw Reservation in Washington State, and they were like, yeah, we've been here for 300 years, and then before that we were down the bay for 400 years, and they had this, like, deep history. And I said, you know what, if I'm gonna, like, get to know this territory, I gotta do it on their terms. And so I'm gonna, like, I'll take the bulletproof plastic kayak, sure, but everything else I got from a dump, like, sourced from a transfer station, and just cobbled it together and did it that way. And it was pretty fun, you know. I remember it as a very, like, lovely period of my life, 40 days of kind of being blissed out.
Fish.
Yeah, eating rockfish. Yeah, it was really, you know, it's good fish. Yeah. So yeah, maybe that's a magazine story or something. But yeah, so that deep, like, dive into the natural world, it's pretty powerful. Pretty powerful. Yeah. I guess that'll wrap up, and I'd love to stick around. Yeah, we'll end with the rockfish. So. Thank you, everyone, for coming, and I would be happy to talk after and talk about books and sign books or what have you. So thanks again.